The cry in the storm. The storm raged outside, its power and intensity relentless as the rain fell in unbroken sheets, drenching everything in sight. Calvin was used to harsh weather. Being a police officer meant that he had faced his share of difficult conditions, but something about the storm tonight felt different. It wasn't just the sheer force of nature battering the streets, there was an eeriness to it, an almost oppressive feeling hanging in the air. As he continued driving through the slick streets, his windshield wipers working overtime, Calvin couldn't help but wonder how many people were out in this weather. The city, normally bustling with the hum of traffic and life, was eerily quiet tonight. The rain seemed to drown out everything else, making the world feel smaller, more enclosed. He hoped he could find shelter soon, perhaps a diner or even a gas station, where he could take a break and regroup. The sudden sound of something faint, yet unmistakable, cut through his thoughts, a weak cry. It was soft at first, almost drowned out by the pounding rain, but then it grew louder. The sound was undeniably human, and instinctively, Calvin's foot eased off the accelerator, his eyes darting to the right. He turned his head, squinting against the rain, and there, in the shadows of a narrow alley, was a flicker of movement. At first, he thought it was nothing more than the gusting wind pushing debris across the street, but then he heard it again, another weak cry, this one desperate, pleading almost. Without thinking, Calvin sharply steered his car toward the alley. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as he pulled over, his mind racing with confusion and concern. Calvin grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and shoved the car door open, his boots hitting the flooded pavement with a splash. The storm was so powerful that the downpour instantly soaked him to the bone, but he didn't hesitate. The cry was clear now, like the faintest sound of a baby in distress, and it filled him with a sense of urgency that cut through the chill of the storm. As Calvin approached the alley, the surrounding buildings loomed high on either side, casting long, shadowed stretches into the rain-soaked street. The alley seemed to absorb the light, swallowing up everything except the sounds of the storm. Calvin squinted through the rain, trying to pinpoint where the cry was coming from, his flashlight barely making a dent in the inky darkness. Then, a rustling noise broke through the cacophony. It was coming from behind a pile of discarded cardboard boxes. He took a step forward, cautiously, his hand gripping the flashlight as he scanned the area, his heart pounding in his chest. The alley was eerily silent except for the rush of rain, but the sound of rustling continued. Calvin moved forward, his boots sinking slightly in the water that had accumulated in the alley, but the noise didn't stop. It grew louder. He rounded the corner, and there, partially hidden behind a trash can, he saw it, a small bundle of cloth, soaked through with rain. His breath caught in his throat, and his heart lurched in his chest. The cry came again, weak but persistent. Calvin approached quickly, his eyes wide with disbelief. What he found was a newborn, its delicate body wrapped in a thin, worn cloth that offered little protection from the elements. Its tiny face, glistening with raindrops, turned up to look at him, eyes wide with fear and confusion. The baby was clearly in distress, its tiny chest rising and falling rapidly, trying to stay warm in the damp, unforgiving night. The child's skin, dark as night, shimmered under the cold rain, but it was so fragile, so vulnerable, and Calvin could see that the baby's limbs were trembling violently from the cold. His heart broke as he knelt down, carefully extending his hand toward the child. Despite the downpour, despite the storm that threatened to engulf everything, Calvin knew he had to act immediately. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the weight of a life that had been discarded, left to the mercy of the night. Without thinking, he wrapped his arms gently around the baby, feeling its fragile body shudder in his arms. The baby's soft, startled cry echoed in the alley, but Calvin didn't flinch. He pulled the tiny form close, sheltering it as best as he could from the rain. The baby was so small, so helpless. It felt like the world had forgotten it, and yet here Calvin was, just in time, it seemed. As he lifted the baby against his chest, he glanced around the alley, searching for any sign of the person who could have left the child here. His eyes searched the shadows, hoping for a clue, but the street remained empty and still. The storm raged on, indifferent to the life that lay in Calvin's arms. He stepped back toward his car, the rain pouring down relentlessly as he held the baby close. The warmth of the child's tiny body pressed against his own seemed to make the storm less threatening, less overwhelming. It was as if the world outside didn't matter, and the only thing that existed in that moment was the fragile life in his arms. Once in his car, Calvin placed the baby on the passenger seat, securing it with his coat. He didn't know what he was going to do, but there was no way he could leave the child out in the storm. His mind raced with questions. How could someone abandon a baby like this? Who would leave a helpless child to fend for itself in such a horrible storm? Calvin's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the rain, his mind focused solely on the child beside him. His thoughts whirled as the storm continued to pound against the car. He couldn't shake the image of the baby's face, wide eyes staring up at him with an innocence that was heartbreaking. Who would do this to such a precious life? He pulled into the station parking lot, the building looming dark and quiet against the storm. The streets were empty, the usual hum of city life drowned out by the downpour. As he stepped out of the car, cradling the baby in his arms once again, a sense of determination filled him. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just hand the baby off to someone else. Not yet, not without knowing what had happened. Inside the station, Calvin's colleagues barely noticed him as he passed through the door, drenched and exhausted. His eyes scanned the room, but all he could think about was the fragile life in his arms. He needed answers, answers about the baby, answers about its parents, answers about why anyone would do this. A few officers nodded to him as he made his way to his desk, where the baby now lay, wrapped in his coat. The infant had fallen into an exhausted sleep, its tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, the only indication that life still stirred in its fragile body. Calvin sat down at his desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he began sifting through the records in search of anything that could help him find the baby's parents. Minutes turned into hours as Calvin pored over birth records, missing persons reports, anything that might give him a lead. But as time passed, his frustration grew. There were no clues, no answers to be found. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. Who was this baby? Where had it come from? Why had someone left it to die in the trash? Just as Calvin was about to give up for the night, a soft voice broke his concentration. It was Officer Harris, a colleague who had walked over to see what he was up to. You should probably take her to an orphanage, Harris suggested, his tone gentle. There's not much else we can do. Her parents must have abandoned her. Calvin looked up, his heart aching as he stared at the baby. He knew what Harris was saying was true, but it didn't sit right with him. Something about this child's situation didn't make sense. Who could do something so cruel? But as he looked down at the delicate face of the baby, sleeping so peacefully, Calvin made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't give up on her. No matter what, he would find out who she was and why she had been abandoned. She deserved more than just to be tossed aside like a forgotten piece of trash. And so, in the stillness of the storm, a new chapter of Calvin's life began, one that would forever change him and the life of the baby he had found on that fateful night. A father's choice. Calvin sat at his desk long after his shift had officially ended, his tired eyes scanning the records in front of him. The baby, wrapped securely in his coat, was resting in a bassinet in the corner of his office. Every few moments, he would glance over at her, watching her tiny chest rise and fall in gentle rhythm. His heart swelled with a deep sense of protectiveness, an emotion he hadn't expected to feel, especially not for a child he had just met. But the baby's vulnerability, her fragile existence, had somehow burrowed itself into his soul. The storm outside had subsided, leaving only the distant rumblings of thunder and the occasional gust of wind that shook the windows. The city, still drenched from the relentless downpour, now seemed quieter. The streets glistened beneath the streetlights as if they were washed clean, but inside the station, the atmosphere was heavy, filled with a mixture of hope, confusion, and dread. Calvin couldn't stop thinking about the baby's origins. Her face, so young and innocent, stared back at him in his thoughts. Where had she come from? What kind of life had she been born into? How could anyone leave such a tiny, defenseless child to face the world alone? His mind wandered to the storm. It had been unforgiving, a merciless tempest that had torn through the city. Was it coincidence that he had found her tonight? Or had the storm somehow guided him to that dark alley? He couldn't say, but the thought lingered in the back of his mind like a question with no answer. The low hum of the station's fluorescent lights seemed to echo in his thoughts as he sifted through paperwork, his fingers numbing from the cold. The urgency that had gripped him earlier seemed to ebb away, replaced with a deep ache in his chest. He needed to know what had happened to the baby's parents, if they even existed. He couldn't just let her slip into the foster system without at least trying to understand who she was and where she came from. But as the hours passed, the records yielded nothing. No birth certificates, no missing person reports, no leads to trace the baby's origins. Calvin's frustration mounted as he reached for yet another file. His hand trembled as he flipped through it, his thoughts more distracted than focused. Calvin? He looked up, startled out of his thoughts. It was Officer Harris again, standing at the doorway, concern etched across his face. Calvin could tell that Harris was no stranger to the pressure of the job, but tonight, something in his demeanor was different. "What's up?" Calvin asked, running a hand through his damp hair. "I just wanted to check on you," Harris replied, stepping into the room. "You've been here for hours. You sure you're okay?" Calvin sighed heavily, feeling the weight of the night pressing on him. "I'm fine. Just trying to figure out what to do with this situation." He gestured toward the bassinet in the corner, where the baby slept soundly, her tiny features peaceful in the quiet of the station. Harris followed Calvin's gaze and nodded, his expression softening. "You know, I've been around long enough to know when something's more than just a job. You've already done what you can by bringing her in, but at some point, you have to let go." Calvin felt a pang of guilt at Harris's words. He knew his colleague meant well. He knew that logically, he should hand the baby over to the authorities and let them take care of it. That was the right thing to do. But there was a voice in the back of his head, louder now than ever, telling him that he couldn't just let her go. Not yet. Not until he knew the full story. "I can't just do that," Calvin muttered, more to himself than to Harris. "There's something about this baby. I don't know what it is, but I can't just turn my back on her." Harris regarded him quietly for a moment, as though weighing his words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "Calvin, listen. I get it. I do. But sometimes we have to make choices. You're a good guy, and I know you want to help. But this is bigger than you. You can't save everyone. You can't be everything to everyone." Calvin swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He understood the sentiment, but it didn't make it easier to accept. He had seen the worst of humanity, he had responded to countless emergencies, witnessed unthinkable horrors, and dealt with the aftermath of tragedy every day. But this was different. The baby's delicate form and the mystery surrounding her seemed to call to something deep inside him. "You don't understand," Calvin said softly. "She didn't deserve this. No one deserves to be abandoned like that." Harris's face softened, but he didn't press further. Instead, he just nodded, offering a supportive silence. "I'm not saying you're wrong," he said finally. "But I think you need to figure out where you go from here. We can't change the past, but we can make the future better for this child." The words lingered in the air between them. Calvin knew Harris was right. He knew there would be a time when he would have to face the reality of the situation. But for now, he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey with this baby was far from over. Later that evening, after the station had grown quiet and the other officers had gone home, Calvin found himself alone with the baby. He watched her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, the soft murmur of her tiny form a comfort amidst the cold, sterile silence of the station. In the solitude of the office, Calvin allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had always been a man of action, quick decisions, quick solutions. But this was different. The baby had no answers, no story to tell. All Calvin had was his instinct, his desire to protect, and a sense of responsibility that tugged at his heart. His thoughts returned to the moment when he had found her, the storm, the rustling trash can, the faint cry in the night. Had he been chosen to find her, or had it been a random twist of fate? Regardless of the answer, Calvin felt a deep, unshakable connection to the baby. It was as if, in that moment, when he had lifted her from the cold pavement, he had made a promise to her. A promise that he would never leave her, never abandon her like so many had before. But what could he do? He was just one man. There were systems in place, social services, child welfare, but those systems weren't always perfect. He had seen it time and time again, children lost in the system, forgotten or neglected, left to grow up without the stability they needed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't rely solely on the system. He couldn't leave this child's fate to chance. Calvin reached for the phone on his desk and dialed the number for Child Protective Services. As the phone rang, he looked down at the baby, her peaceful face reflecting the innocence that had been robbed from her. She deserved better than this, a life full of love, safety, and security. And Calvin was determined to give her that. But in the back of his mind, he knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. When the phone call ended, Calvin took a deep breath, a sense of resolution settling within him. He had a plan now, a way forward. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start with. The baby's fate was now in his hands, and he wasn't going to let go of her, not without a fight. Searching for answers. The days following Calvin's decision to not let the baby slip away were full of sleepless nights, endless paperwork, and countless hours of uncertainty. Every day, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Despite his best efforts, he was no closer to discovering the truth about the baby's parents. The system, cold and indifferent, seemed to offer no answers, and the little girl, who had already found a home in his heart, was still a mystery. The storm had long passed, and the city had begun to recover from its wrath. The streets, now bathed in sunlight, seemed so much more alive, almost to the point of mockery. But inside the walls of the station, things felt frozen, as though time itself had stalled in the wake of the discovery Calvin had made. Each time he came in, he would check on the baby first, his eyes drawn to the small cradle where she slept, oblivious to the storm that had brought them together. Her name was still unknown. The birth records were inconclusive, and there had been no missing person reports matching her age or physical description. There was nothing to explain her abandonment, no sign that she belonged to anyone. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere, left in the trash as if discarded, forgotten. Calvin could hardly stand the thought of the baby being sent into the foster system. He had seen too many children lost in that maze, shuffled from one temporary home to the next, their names fading into the background, their lives slipping through the cracks. But he also knew that he couldn't keep her forever. His job, his life, was here at the station. He had no family of his own, no support system. He was alone in this. Each day, as he sifted through the records, his sense of helplessness grew. He couldn't make sense of the situation, and the more he tried, the more he realized how little control he had over the outcome. His thoughts often turned to the baby, to what might happen to her if he couldn't find her parents. What if they never came forward? What if she spent her life in an orphanage, always searching for a family that didn't exist? But as time wore on, he began to notice something different in the way he viewed the baby. It was subtle at first, an instinctive care, a bond forming in the quiet hours of the night, when the station was empty and the only sounds were the steady ticking of the clock and the occasional shuffle of paper. He had come to feel a sense of ownership over her, a protector of sorts, though he knew that nothing about this situation could truly be his to control. One evening, just as Calvin was about to leave for the night, he received a call that would change everything. It was Mrs. Stevens, the social worker who had been handling the case. Her voice sounded strained, almost hesitant, as she spoke. "Calvin, I have some news," she said, her words laced with caution. "We've tracked down a potential lead. It's not much, but it's something." Calvin's heart raced as he listened intently. "What kind of lead?" "I can't go into all the details just yet, but we've found a person who might know something about the baby. She may be connected to the child's mother. I need you to meet me at the station as soon as you can. We've arranged a meeting with someone who has information." Without hesitation, Calvin grabbed his jacket and hurried out the door. His mind spun with possibilities, his heart pounding in his chest. Could this be the breakthrough he had been waiting for? The answers that had eluded him for days might finally be within reach. When Calvin arrived at the station, Mrs. Stevens was waiting in the conference room. The room was small, dimly lit, and a stack of papers lay on the table in front of her. A woman sat across from her, a nervous look in her eyes. She was older, perhaps in her late 30s, and wore a faded jacket and jeans, as though she had been through her fair share of hard times. "This is Lisa," Mrs. Stevens said as she introduced the woman. "She's a friend of Vanessa, the baby's mother. We've been in contact with her for a while now, and she's willing to talk." Calvin nodded, his heart heavy with a sense of anticipation. This was it, the first real lead he had gotten. He took a seat across from Lisa, studying her face carefully. She looked tired, worn, but there was something in her eyes that made him cautious. She wasn't here by choice, Calvin could tell that much. She had been pulled into this somehow, perhaps against her will. "Thank you for coming in," Calvin said, his voice calm but firm. "We're trying to understand what happened to the baby. Her mother, Vanessa, seems to have disappeared, and we're looking for any information that could help us locate her. Can you tell us anything about her?" Lisa hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I don't know much," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Vanessa, she's been through a lot. She didn't have an easy life. She was in and out of foster care when she was a kid, and after she got out, it wasn't much better. I think she just wanted a fresh start. But she got involved with the wrong people. People who didn't have her best interests at heart." Calvin listened closely, his mind racing as he pieced together what Lisa was saying. Vanessa, the baby's mother, had come from a broken past, one that was filled with instability, loss, and trauma. It wasn't an excuse for what she had done, but it helped to explain the choices she had made. A fresh start was something everyone longed for, but for someone like Vanessa, it had been out of reach. Lisa continued, her voice trembling now. "Vanessa wasn't always like this. She was scared. When she found out she was pregnant, she didn't know what to do. She didn't have anyone, and I think she thought she couldn't give the baby the life she deserved. That's when she made the decision to leave her." Calvin's heart sank. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Vanessa hadn't abandoned her child out of malice, but out of fear and desperation. She had been overwhelmed, isolated, and unable to see any other way out. "You're telling me that she just left the baby?" Calvin asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He couldn't bring himself to imagine what it must have felt like for a mother to leave her own child in such a way. "I don't think she meant to hurt her," Lisa replied, her voice thick with emotion. "She thought it would be better. She thought the baby would have a better chance without her. But I think she regretted it the moment she did it. I think she just couldn't face what she had done. The room fell silent for a moment as Calvin processed Lisa's words. The emotions swirling inside him were impossible to contain. The baby, the innocent little life that had been left in the alley, had been abandoned by a mother who had thought she was doing the right thing. But in the end, she had made the ultimate sacrifice. She had given up her child to give her a chance at a better life. It was a tragic and misguided choice, but it was still a choice made out of love. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Calvin spoke again. "Where is Vanessa now? Is she safe?" Lisa wiped her eyes and shook her head. "I don't know. She's been in and out of trouble, but I haven't heard from her in a while. I think she's in a bad place right now. But if you find her, if you tell her that her baby is safe, maybe she'll want to come back." Calvin nodded slowly, his heart heavy with a sense of finality. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they still didn't form a complete picture. Vanessa's story was a tragic one, and yet, it was clear that the baby had been loved, even if that love had been expressed in the most painful way possible. As Lisa left the room, Calvin turned to Mrs. Stevens, his mind swirling with questions. "What now?" he asked, his voice quiet with exhaustion. "We keep looking," Mrs. Stevens replied gently. "We'll track down Vanessa, and we'll see what happens. But at least now we know she didn't abandon her child out of cruelty. She just didn't know how to handle it." Calvin sat back in his chair, his mind still reeling. He had found a piece of the puzzle, but there was still so much left to uncover. One thing was certain, though, this baby's journey was far from over. And neither was his. The unexpected connection. Calvin felt an uncomfortable weight settle on his chest as he absorbed the news that Vanessa had, in her own broken way, loved her child. The brief interaction with Lisa had shed some light on the tragedy that had led to the baby being abandoned, but there were still so many unanswered questions. The complexities of Vanessa's life were just beginning to unfold, but there was a part of Calvin that felt as though the answers would never be enough to absolve her of what she had done. Could there ever be a justification for leaving a child out in the cold to fend for herself? But Calvin knew one thing for certain: he couldn't just let this story end here. He had to know where Vanessa was, what had happened to her, and how they could bring her back into her daughter's life, if that was even possible. He had seen the devastation in Lisa's eyes, and he understood now that Vanessa wasn't some heartless criminal. She was a woman who had been torn apart by circumstances beyond her control, someone who had lost her way but who, deep down, had never stopped caring for her child. That evening, as the station emptied out, Calvin sat in his office, staring at the baby, still nameless, still in his care, wondering what the next step would be. What would happen to her if he couldn't find her mother? He had done his part by protecting her, but he couldn't keep her forever. The system would eventually claim her if no one came forward. The thoughts swirling in his mind were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside his office door. Calvin looked up to see Mrs. Stevens stepping inside, her face grim. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. Calvin stood up, a sense of dread creeping over him. "What's happened?" Mrs. Stevens glanced around, her gaze lingering on the sleeping baby. "It's about Vanessa," she began. "We've tracked her down." Calvin's heart skipped a beat. After days of frustration, after the trail had seemed to go cold, they had finally found her? He felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by caution. "Where is she?" Calvin asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "She's not in a good place, Calvin," Mrs. Stevens continued, her words slow and deliberate. "We found her living in an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. She's been surviving on the streets for the last few months, and from what we've gathered, she's not in a stable state. She's dealing with addiction, and she's in pretty bad shape." The news hit Calvin harder than he had expected. Vanessa, the woman he had hoped would have some semblance of stability, was drowning in a world of despair. The mother of the child he had found, the woman who had made a desperate decision to abandon her baby, was lost in a way that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "What happens now?" he asked. Mrs. Stevens shook her head. "We've contacted the authorities, but we're trying to work with her in a more compassionate way. She doesn't trust anyone, but we're going to give her some time. She needs help, not just the law. But I wanted you to know, this changes things." Calvin felt the ground beneath him shift. Vanessa wasn't just a mother who had abandoned her child. She was someone who had been completely broken by the world. The thought of her out there, struggling in the shadows, made him sick with helplessness. How could she be expected to care for her child when she could barely care for herself? He knew that saving Vanessa would be just as important, if not more so, than protecting her daughter. "We're going to have to be patient," Mrs. Stevens said, almost as if reading his mind. "But if she's willing to work with us, we can offer her a path out. It's not going to be easy, but she's got a chance, Calvin. It's not over yet." Calvin nodded slowly, though the weight of the situation was pressing on him like a vice. "I want to be there when you talk to her," he said quietly. "I think I can help. I think I can get through to her." Mrs. Stevens studied him for a moment before speaking. "I understand. But this is delicate, Calvin. If we rush in too fast, we might push her further away. We need to approach her carefully. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Calvin didn't hesitate. "I have to be. For her. For the baby. I can't just let her slip away again." Mrs. Stevens met his gaze, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "All right. We'll move forward, then. But you'll need to be prepared for what comes next." The next day, after much preparation and numerous phone calls, Calvin, Mrs. Stevens, and a small team of officers made their way to the rundown building on the outskirts of the city where Vanessa had been hiding. The area was desolate, littered with the debris of forgotten lives. It was a stark contrast to the world Calvin was used to, a world of order and structure. The crumbling buildings stood as silent sentinels to the lives lost within their walls. When they arrived, the air was thick with tension. Calvin could feel his pulse quicken, the uncertainty of what lay ahead weighing heavily on him. He was about to meet the woman who had left a helpless child to the mercy of the storm. Could he see her as the person Lisa had described, a mother who had been consumed by fear and desperation? Or would the anger and betrayal cloud his judgment? The building was silent, the faint hum of traffic in the distance the only sign of life. Mrs. Stevens led the group to a small entrance at the back of the building. They knocked, their footsteps echoing through the hallways, but there was no answer. Calvin's heart rate quickened. What if she wasn't there? What if she had slipped away again, back into the shadows? But then, a voice from behind the door, hoarse and weak, called out, "Who's there?" Mrs. Stevens stepped forward cautiously, speaking gently. "Vanessa, it's us. We're here to help." There was a long pause before the door creaked open. When it did, Calvin's stomach dropped. The woman standing before them was gaunt, her face drawn with exhaustion. She was disheveled, her hair matted, her eyes dull with the signs of someone who had been fighting a battle she couldn't win. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Calvin's eyes locked on Vanessa's face, and he could see the weight of years of hardship etched into her features. She looked so small, so lost. The anger that had initially surged in him upon hearing about her abandonment was gone, replaced by a quiet sorrow. Vanessa was no longer the woman who had left her child in the trash, she was a woman broken by the world. She looked up at him, recognition flashing in her eyes, followed by something deeper. Regret. Fear. A profound sense of helplessness. Calvin spoke softly, his voice steady but gentle. "We found her. Your daughter. She's safe. She's been with us. We've been trying to understand. You don't have to do this alone. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. She stepped back, as though the words had physically struck her. I didn't want to leave her. I thought I was doing what was best for her. But I've failed her, haven't I? Her voice trembled, a broken sob catching in her throat. Calvin reached out, carefully offering his hand. You don't have to be alone in this, Vanessa. We're here. And so is your daughter. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Vanessa stepped forward, her fragile hands trembling as they reached for Calvin's. Please. I need to see her, she whispered. And for the first time since that stormy night, Calvin felt a sense of hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, and the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but it was a beginning. Vanessa had taken the first step toward redemption, and for the child, the chance at a future that had seemed so uncertain just days ago now felt just a little bit brighter. Calvin knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, for him, for Vanessa, or for the child who had brought them all together. But in that moment, standing in the dim light of that forgotten building, Calvin understood that the most important thing in life was to hold on, no matter how difficult it became. Because sometimes, the greatest connections were the ones that came when you least expected them. And for the first time in a long while, Calvin felt that he was finally on the right path. The unraveling. The weeks that followed the meeting in the abandoned building were filled with a quiet, uneasy hope. For Vanessa, it was the first time in a long time that she felt a glimmer of possibility. But it was also the beginning of a long and arduous journey, one where she would need to confront not only her past but also the fractured pieces of herself she had long tried to bury. And for Calvin, it was a journey into the heart of what it truly meant to be a protector, to offer a second chance when the world seemed ready to give up on someone. After their meeting, Vanessa agreed to enter a rehabilitation program, a last-ditch effort to reclaim her life and, possibly, the chance to be the mother her daughter deserved. Calvin visited her regularly, his role shifting from the officer who had found her child to the steady, reassuring presence who had helped her start to heal. She wasn't ready to take full responsibility for her actions, not yet. But each time Calvin saw her, he could see that she was making small steps forward. It was a slow, painful process, but it was progress. Meanwhile, the baby, whose name had yet to be revealed to Calvin, remained in the care of a foster home, safe and well looked after, but Calvin couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't where she was meant to be. He visited her as often as he could, and each time, it tore at his heart. He wasn't her father, and he couldn't claim her as his own. But the bond between them had grown. He had become something of a surrogate father, a figure who had stepped in during the most critical moments of her life. It was a strange position to be in, but as the weeks blurred together, the question of whether he could let go of the child began to consume him. He knew he couldn't keep her forever, not with the responsibility of his job and the complexities of his own life. But could he stand by while she was placed in the system? Could he trust that anyone else would give her the love and care she needed? One afternoon, after another long shift, Calvin sat at his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. His mind was miles away, consumed by thoughts of the baby and the unknowns of her future. He didn't know how long he could keep up this charade. The emotional toll was becoming harder to bear. The answer to all his questions seemed elusive. Was he doing the right thing? Was there a place for him in the child's future, or had his involvement been only temporary? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mrs. Stevens. "Calvin," she said, her voice low, as though choosing her words carefully. "We've got a development with Vanessa. She's taken a huge step, but we need your help." Calvin sat up, his pulse quickening. "What kind of step?" "She's agreed to attend a program that deals with trauma recovery," Mrs. Stevens explained. "It's a huge commitment, and it's going to be difficult for her. But she's asking to be reinstated as the baby's legal guardian, and she wants you to be there when she talks to the court." The words hit Calvin like a thunderclap. Vanessa wanted her child back. She was asking for the chance to try again, to be the mother she had never been. And yet, part of him hesitated. He had grown attached to the baby, and the thought of losing her felt like an insurmountable loss. Could Vanessa truly be ready to care for her? Could anyone be ready after the past they had both lived through? The uncertainty gnawed at Calvin as he tried to piece together what Vanessa was asking. He had seen her at her lowest, drug-addicted, broken by the world she had lived in. Was that who she still was? Or had the time she spent away from her daughter, the therapy, the rehabilitation, allowed her to rebuild herself into someone who could give her child the love and stability she deserved? Calvin knew that this decision wasn't his alone. The court would be the final authority, but he was an integral part of that decision. He had seen both sides of Vanessa, her past self, and the person she was now becoming. He had watched her fight to overcome the wreckage of her life, and there was part of him that believed in her ability to rise above it. But there was another part of him, one that couldn't deny the deep bond he had formed with the child. He wasn't a father, but the baby had come into his life in the most vulnerable way possible, and in that moment, she had changed him. Calvin had stepped in when no one else had, and he had come to care for her in a way that felt like something deeper than just responsibility. After several sleepless nights, Calvin finally made the decision. He would support Vanessa, but he couldn't stand by and let her take the baby without knowing, truly knowing, that she was capable of giving her a good life. He would stand by her in the courtroom, yes, but only if he felt certain that she had truly changed, that she was ready to be the mother her daughter deserved. The day of the court hearing arrived. Calvin felt as though he was standing at the edge of a cliff, peering into an abyss of uncertainty. He had heard so many stories about children who were taken away from their biological parents because they were deemed unfit. There were so many systems in place to protect the vulnerable, but the reality was always messier than the law allowed for. Was Vanessa ready? Could she provide a stable future for her daughter? As they sat in the courtroom, Vanessa looked different. Gone was the wild-eyed desperation he had first seen in her, replaced by a quiet determination. She had cleaned up, attended every meeting, and put in the work that had been asked of her. Her hands, though still shaky, held a sense of purpose. She was ready to face whatever came next, and Calvin had no doubt that this time, her desire to be a mother was genuine. The judge, a stern woman with a calm but firm presence, called the hearing to order. Vanessa sat up straighter in her seat, while Calvin remained silent, his heart thumping in his chest. Vanessa's lawyer spoke first, presenting her case for guardianship, emphasizing Vanessa's commitment to recovery and her desire to be reunited with her daughter. Calvin could feel the weight of her gaze as she glanced over at him. He hadn't spoken to her about how he felt, not directly. There was so much left unsaid between them. But this was the moment where his actions, his support, would speak louder than anything else. When it was Calvin's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his palms sweating. The room seemed unnaturally quiet as he approached the stand. "Your Honor," Calvin began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had been holding inside. "I've seen Vanessa's struggles. I've seen her at her lowest. But I've also seen her work every day to rebuild herself. She's not the person she was when I first found her. She has shown determination, strength, and a willingness to change. I believe in her. I believe she can be the mother her daughter deserves." There was a long pause. Vanessa's eyes were fixed on Calvin, and he could see the silent gratitude in them, a thank you that spoke volumes more than words could ever express. The judge nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you, Officer Calvin. We will take your statement into account." The hearing continued for what felt like hours, but eventually, the decision was made. The judge ruled that Vanessa would be granted custody of her daughter, but there were conditions. Vanessa would continue her treatment and would have to meet with social services regularly to ensure she maintained her stability. The road ahead would still be difficult, but the judge believed that with the support she had now, Vanessa could succeed. When the hearing was over, Vanessa turned to Calvin, her eyes welling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd get this chance. I never thought I'd get her back." Calvin smiled, but the emotions swirling within him made it difficult to keep his composure. He had given his heart to this child, and now, as Vanessa stood beside him, it was clear that his role in her life was coming to an end. He had done what he could, had made the hard decisions, and now it was time for Vanessa to take over. It was time for her to prove that she could be the mother her daughter needed. As they left the courthouse, Vanessa's hand trembling in his, Calvin felt a bittersweet sense of closure. The future wasn't guaranteed for them, but it was a new beginning, a chance for Vanessa to step up and create the life she had longed for. The baby, no longer just the child he had found in the trash, now had a mother to return to, a future to look forward to. And Calvin? He had done his part. He had stepped into the gap when no one else had. He had found the strength to do what was right, even when it hurt. For now, he would walk away with the knowledge that, sometimes, saving a life wasn't about making everything perfect, it was about giving someone the chance to make it right. A second chance. The days that followed the court hearing were a blur for Calvin. The ruling had been a win for Vanessa, a step toward healing and redemption. But for Calvin, it was a moment that came with a certain sadness he wasn't prepared for. His role as protector had been clear, he had found the baby, cared for her, and ensured her safety. But now, as Vanessa walked away with her daughter, he knew that his involvement in their lives was fading, slipping quietly into the past. Vanessa was committed to doing everything she could to prove she was capable of raising her daughter. The months that followed were filled with therapy sessions, counseling, and ongoing check-ins with social services. She worked hard, determined to maintain the stability she had fought so hard to achieve. The small victories, the days when she felt strong enough to pick up her daughter without fear, when she made it through another session without relapsing, were the moments that began to shape her transformation. Calvin visited them occasionally, watching from a distance as Vanessa proved that she wasn't the same woman who had been lost in addiction. She was learning to mother, to be present in a way that she had never been before. The baby, now almost 2 years old, was growing healthy and strong, her laughter ringing through the small house that had become their home. Calvin could see the bond between them, and it was clear that the love Vanessa had for her daughter was real, deep, and unshakable. But as time went on, Calvin couldn't deny the quiet ache that lingered in his chest. He had been there when no one else was, and he had played a part in saving the little girl's life. But now, he was a visitor in their world, an outsider watching from the periphery. The role he had once held, the protector, had shifted, and with it, the space he had once occupied in the lives of Vanessa and her daughter had been filled by something more permanent, more intimate, family. It was one evening, as he sat on the porch of his small apartment, sipping a cup of coffee, that the phone rang. The sound startled him, and he grabbed the receiver with a sense of urgency, unsure of what to expect. "Calvin," came Vanessa's voice, shaking and uncertain. There was a catch in her breath, a tremor in her tone that immediately set off alarm bells in Calvin's mind. "Can you come over? I need you." Without a second thought, Calvin grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door. Something in Vanessa's voice made him fear the worst. When he arrived at her house, he found her standing in the doorway, holding her daughter close to her chest. The little girl's face was streaked with tears, her tiny hands gripping her mother tightly. "Vanessa, what's happened?" Calvin asked, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped inside. She didn't immediately answer. Her eyes were filled with panic, but there was also something else there, a sense of exhaustion. She looked as though she had been fighting a battle with herself and had finally lost. "It's me," Vanessa whispered, her voice cracking. I've been slipping. I thought I could do this on my own, but I can't. I feel like I'm going to break. I don't know how to do this, Calvin. I don't want to lose her." Calvin's heart twisted at the sight of her, broken and vulnerable. It was a stark reminder of how fragile recovery could be, how a single misstep could send someone back into the darkness they had fought so hard to escape. But he also saw something else in Vanessa's eyes, a desperation to keep going, a desire to change, even if it seemed impossible. He walked toward her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Vanessa, you've come so far," he said gently. "This is just a moment, not the end. You're not going to lose her. You don't have to fight this alone." Vanessa closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she nodded, but she still seemed uncertain. Calvin could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that, despite all her hard work, she wasn't enough. That she wasn't strong enough to be the mother her daughter deserved. "I'm so scared, Calvin," she whispered. "What if I fail her again? What if I can't do this?" Calvin took a deep breath, trying to steady his own emotions, as he knelt in front of her daughter, now curled up in her arms. The child's small, tear-streaked face was a mirror of the uncertainty Vanessa felt. Calvin gently wiped the girl's cheek, offering a small, comforting smile. "You won't fail her," Calvin said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "You're here. You're trying. And that matters more than anything. I've seen you change. I've seen you fight. And that's what's going to get you through." Vanessa's trembling hand reached for his, her grip tightening. "I don't want to hurt her, Calvin. I just want to be the mother she needs." Calvin's heart ached for her, but he knew the path ahead would be a difficult one. He wasn't naive. Addiction didn't disappear overnight, and healing wasn't linear. But Vanessa had proven time and time again that she had the strength to overcome the odds, and he wasn't about to give up on her now. "You've already taken the hardest step," Calvin said, his voice steady. "You've asked for help. You've admitted that you need support. That's the foundation of everything else. We'll get through this, Vanessa. One step at a time." That night, after sitting with her and offering the comfort he could, Calvin promised to help her find the resources she needed. He called in favors, spoke with her counselor, and helped secure more regular meetings. Vanessa was willing to continue her treatment, she had to, and Calvin was there to ensure she didn't feel like she was walking the path alone. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks. There were days when Vanessa felt like giving up, days when she questioned whether she was ever going to be good enough. But with Calvin by her side and the support of those who truly cared about her, she was slowly reclaiming her life, one piece at a time. A year passed, and Vanessa's transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. The baby, now a toddler, full of energy and joy, was thriving. The bond between mother and daughter had deepened into something powerful and unbreakable. They had built a life together, and though the road had been long and difficult, it had been theirs to walk. One afternoon, as Calvin stood at the doorstep of their home, watching as Vanessa played with her daughter in the yard, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle within him. The journey they had all been on, the child, Vanessa, and himself, had shaped each of them in ways they could never have anticipated. Calvin had learned that saving someone wasn't about fixing their broken pieces, it was about offering them the chance to heal, to find their own strength. And sometimes, that meant letting go, trusting that they could make it on their own. As Vanessa looked up and smiled at him, her face glowing with a happiness he had never seen in her before, Calvin felt a deep sense of pride. He had played a part in this, a part in the creation of something beautiful and fragile. And now, it was time for him to step back. He had done what he could, and he had given them both a chance at a future. "Thank you, Calvin," Vanessa said softly, her voice full of gratitude. "I don't think I could have done this without you." Calvin smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet, unspoken pride. "You didn't do it alone, Vanessa," he said. "But you did it." As he turned to leave, he knew that his role in their lives was coming to an end. But he also knew that, no matter what, he would always be a part of their story. A story of love, redemption, and second chances. And that, he thought, was more than enough.